Welcome back to another Odyssey 40k video. My name's Chris, and in this video we're going to be talking about team compositions and how to make the best team you possibly can in your games of Warhammer 40,000. I hope you enjoy. So what does team composition mean in Warhammer 40k? Well, it talks about teams 40k, which is either it varies the amount of people from, you can have 3-person teams, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10-person teams. The most common are usually 4, 5, and 8 for the size of the teams. And this one we're going to be talking about mainly about 5s, but we'll bring in a little bit of 8s content as well, just to kind of flesh things out. But it's what 5 to 8 factions you choose to pick for your armies. So, and in teams, you have like certain things you have to think about, like why does it matter? Like, why do you want to pick these 5 to 8 factions? The differences in comp styles, so you can go for a really heavy skew in different directions. And in this video, we're also going to talk about how to pick what skew or what kind of composition of factions to best suit your team and what you want to do for the tournament that you're going to. So the first thing we need to think about is the rules. So these are kind of rules that are stagnant between all kind of teams 40k, and definitely these might flex a little bit depending on the specific event. Some of them are more relaxed. I know a lot of 3s events allow you to pick Marines in multiple ways. So really, make sure you read the players pack with these, but these are kind of the generic rules that kind of apply to all teams events. So you can't duplicate factions. So you can't take 2 AdMechs, you can't take 2 Chaos Space Marines. Allies also count as a picked faction. So if you take the new Demons Shadow Legion detachment and take Chaos Knights, Demons, and Chaos Space Marines in it, you cannot take those factions in any of your other armies, even though you're not taking a full faction of them. You're using that faction, and it counts as it being out for the rest of your team. And only 1 Space Marine faction, so even though Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Black Templars are all different to the Space Marine Codex, they all supplement off the Space Marine Codex, so they all count as one thing. So if you take any of the Space Marine factions and any of the offshoot factions, they all count as one. So if you take one, all Space Marines are out. That's a good thing to note. And yeah, and allies count as a picked faction. So with those things in mind, that's kind of how the team comp becomes a bit more interesting, because you can't just, oh, well, this army is really, really strong at the moment. You can't just spam 5 of them or 8 of them or how many ever. Obviously, that also just wouldn't make a really great team comp, because as soon as you go up against someone that has built an army to counter that army, a comp to counter that army, you're really not doing very well. So that's kind of the basic rules of what you need to think about. Next, are we talking about 5s or 8s? These are the main 2 sizes. You do get some other flexing sizes, but the main ones we're going to be talking about are 5-man and 8-man teams tournaments. So what do you need to, what's the biggest distinction? Obviously, apart from the amount of people in attendance, with 5s, if you skew your list, which means you're going more in a mech or an infantry, or the more kind of diversification of your armies, it can really change what you need to do. So I would recommend going for a more stable list of 5. Whereas if you're going for 8, you can skew harder whilst retaining some balance, because if you skew with 4 of your factions, you'll still have 4 factions that aren't skewed and maybe a bit more balanced, that kind of can balance each other out and stop you from getting really punished for matchups where your skew, your vehicles or your infantry or whatever your composition might have, from dealing what they need to do. So that having those other balance lists kind of helps eliminate the risk. Whereas in 5s, if you skew 3 or 4 of your armies, then you only have 1 list that can counter other things, which is really just not that great. It can really make for some really swingy pairings and rounds depending on who you go up against. But both have different styles. Both play very differently. Pairings for both are very different. We're not going to go into pairing specifically in this. We're going to talk about a couple of niche things about how you can pin opponents and stuff like that. But we're not going to go into how to pair. That's probably going to be its own video that I'll do at some point. but they have different styles, right? So like being able to keep, like 8s pairs very differently to 5s. 5s is very linear. 8s is a bit more dynamic with how the second round, the scrum effectively happens kind of halfway through or towards the end. But apart from that, it's fairly similar. You can take from basically from the rest of this video, you can take everything from all the slides and kind of figure out how you want to work it towards 5s or 8s. So what are the different styles? So we have extreme skews where all or maybe all bar one of your factions is skewed towards a certain style, whether it's we want to take all the vehicles. So we're going to take Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, Space Marine Ironstorm, and Custodes Dreads. And then maybe one flex that's maybe slightly less vehicle heavy, or even just 5 or 8 vehicle heavy lists. You might even want to take Synaptic Nexus Tyranids, and then because they have a bit more infantry, because they can take a bunch of Gargoyles and Termagants and Hormagaunts and stuff like that to kind of play a bit more of the game. So then you have these heavy skew lists, and the idea there is with the extremes is, yes, you pretty are susceptible to some armies, but you might just be able to, especially if you can figure out your meta and what you expect other teams to have, you can skew your matchups that you're just going to have more favorable matchups because of the skew that you choose. The next approach would be the meta, which is just taking the 5 best lists that you think of, which is like taking the 5 best singles lists, taking them in the team, or taking the 5 best balanced lists, understanding that you need some things that can deal with vehicles, some things that can deal with infantry, some things that can deal with, so like a pressure list, something that wants to table you really quickly. If you have balanced army lists that can kind of take on all comers, those kind of lists can work really well, but you're also not expecting huge wins in a lot of your games. You're kind of hoping that your player skill kind of pushes you above, which is good, but also has its own drawbacks. And then we have a targeted skew. So this is kind of like a balance, like a mix between the balanced and meta and the extreme skews. This is where you take 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 of a skew. So like let's say like melee pressure, you take a really aggressive Custodes list, you take Creations of Biochaos Space Marine, something really fast and hits really hard, and then you also take a Tyranid Vanguard list, which is also super aggressive. So you have these 3 really aggressive lists, and then you have 2 just, okay, doesn't matter what I go into, maybe you take like an AdMech or just a Space Marine list that's just designed like a Gladiator, which can kind of go into everything and just do fairly well, that kind of stuff. So you kind of have this like partial skew, but then the rest is balanced. So it kind of like, as I said earlier, it kind of like balances out. You can use your skew correctly, but if you go into a round where like, okay, the call here wasn't correct with these 3 armies, we still have something to fall back on. Something's probably going to get a big loss, but now let's try and get one of our more balanced lists into something a bit more favorable. So that's kind of what we're thinking there when it comes to the targeted skew. So now let's go into our different skews that we have here. Obviously, there's a huge amount of different things you can get into here. The first one we're going to talk about is the infantry skew. So this is the horde. This is how many bodies can you take, how durable the bodies are. This could also be like, yeah, like how many Terminators can you take. If you want to take maximum Deathwing Terminators and then just a bunch more Terminators and just have this 2-up save, just an incredibly durable infantry style list. Well, this kind of like jail lists are also a really good like infantry style. So like the Renegade Raiders, Chaos Space Marine, triple ACDC brick with a couple of guns. It doesn't have to be all infantry, just that predominantly is an infantry based list. So whenever I'm talking about like a skew, it doesn't mean like, oh, well, I can't take anything that isn't exactly the keyword that I've referenced. It's about playing lists that are strong, but maximize the keyword, which is like infantry or vehicle or whatever it might be, to its maximum advantage in the pairing side as well as the composition side. So here's like 3 armies here that are really, really good at that. Tyranids can do like a fairly strong Endless Swarm, kind of just like flood the board. Also like GSC can do a really good one with Final Day. You also have Orcs that can do Green Tide. Warhorde can do a really good infantry skew. Bully Boys can also do a really heavy infantry build. You can also do like a bunch of trucks, but with a lot of guys inside. So you still have the vehicles, but you kind of build it with like, well, there's an overwhelming amount of infantry, but you can still keep them in trucks, so they can get a bit more speed, a bit more survivability in different ways. So just because it's you want to emphasize the infantry side of things doesn't mean it has to be just infantry. You can kind of build in a bunch of different ways. Same with the admech list. You probably want a lot of infantry. You probably want a lot of the Skitarii Vanguard and Rangers, but you also probably want a bunch of Taraxi. So you have these fast-moving infantry, but you also might want some. What are the chickens called? I actually can't remember the name. the layers chickens, because you want some damage there. You want some Doom Riders. You want some Scorpius Disintegrators. You kind of want the vehicles as well, but the bulk of the list is this kind of targeted infantry build. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the infantry lists. So why would you want to go infantry skew? So you can overwhelm in a vehicle heavy meta. Vehicles aren't necessarily very good at dealing with large, like extremely large amounts of infantry. So if you're using a vehicle list, so like a Space Marine Ironstorm is probably a good example here. You'll probably have 1 or 2 Gladiator Reapers, but you also might have 1 or 2 Lancers and 2 to 3 Ballistus Dreads. Now, the Ballistus Dreads and the Lancers actually aren't really good at killing 10-man infantry units, or 20-man infantry units, or whatever it might be. Like, yes, the Reapers are a problem, but everything else on this kind of actually falls short, potentially. So being able to overwhelm it by like, okay, like, I don't have to win by a lot, but if I get in differential 12-8 in my favor because I can hold the primary a bit stronger and just have wave after wave after wave of these units coming out that they can't deal with fast enough, you can win those matchups. So if you think that you're going to be in like in a vehicle heavy meta, so if you think Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, Space Marine Ironstorm, the Death Guard, Plague Storm list was kind of what it's called. A bunch of these different demonic incursion, where it's just like a bunch of the big demons, all those kinds of things. If you think those are going to be really prominent at your team's event, again, these are all meta calls you're going to have to make before you know what people are actually taking. So it's kind of you got to kind of play the field, understand what's strong at the moment. But if you think those things are strong, infantry skews can be really interesting. Like a really interesting concept to go for. And yeah, as I said, transports count. You need to make sure that you're utilizing everything for an infantry list. Infantry love transports, so just because you're trying to go infantry doesn't mean you need to stop taking transports and the things that actually make your infantry better. You want to capitalize on everything that they're good at, not necessarily be like, well, okay, no, I can't take anything else. You want to supplement everything together and make a cohesive army that is just based on infantry. And just one thing, just like everyone, play on a clock. If you're playing over 100 models, even if you're the fastest player, play on a clock. It just makes life so much easier. Your opponent's never going to feel... often your opponent will feel like that and be the one below on time because you'll know how to play your army, but they don't know how to play against your army, so they'll get a lot of decision paralysis. So the clock is just as much for you as it is for your opponent, but if you're playing on a clock with this kind of style list, it means that you acknowledge that both of you have a fair amount of time and you really want to play a fair game and you want to make sure that you both have a fair amount of time. So that's kind of the infantry style skew. Those are kind of some of the things. Really strong in a vehicle heavy meta, or a meta that's just really susceptible to a lot of infantry. Vehicles is just one notable type into that. Next we have the vehicle skew. So this is your Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights. This is your Ironstorms, your Hammer of the Emperor, Astra Militarum lists. All this kind of stuff. Your Vanguard Nid, not Vanguard Nids, like Leviathan Nids, Synaptic Nexus Nids, Crusher Stampede Nids, a lot of different Nids that are all like a lot of vehicles or a lot of monsters. Obviously, vehicle and monster is very interchangeable here. This can be really interesting in a very different way, whereas like you're taking a lot of toughness 10 plus, or a lot of toughness 11 plus, or a lot of toughness 12 plus. Like all this kind of stuff is like, well, you're taking this to overwhelm the other side of the metric than infantry. If you think it's a meta where people need to be playing a lot of like trading games where like, oh, you got to send one little thing out and I'll kill it with one little thing and we just play that game. If you think that's the meta, changing that, like kind of making like a shift in like dimension here and playing a different style game. So like, well, they're not used to that. Like playing, 2 big knights and a bunch of small knights, or playing an Ironstorm list that's just really aggressive. like maybe even a bunch of dreadnoughts or something like that. Like all this kind of stuff can really can change the dynamic of the team comp and change the dynamic of how pairings will work for your team. Because if your opponent's not geared towards killing 3 to 4 vehicle lists, and maybe they have 2 lists that are good into it, cool. If you have 4 to 5, you're gonna get all of your other 2 into good matchups, and so you have 2 bad matchups, 2 good matchups. Your bad matchups are understanding that they just need to go for as many points as possible, and your good matchups need to try and push as hard as they can. Then you've got one kind of like flex, which will actually often be your first defender if you have the 5th flex spot, because you want to try and pull away whatever is the worst option that they can give you as a attacker to make sure you have the best options going forward. So what makes vehicle skews interesting? Usually going for even wins and losses. This is kind of what I was mentioning, is you're going to win a couple of games, but you're going to lose a couple of games. Interestingly enough, though, you can kind of figure out how this is going to work, and you can gear a couple of your vehicle lists to be a bit more, what I'll say is wide. And what I mean by wide is a list that can score consistently even into something that's a bad matchup. So maybe it has a bit more infantry in them. Maybe it's something like a Space Marine Iron Storm, where you can still take 3 units of JPI, 2 units of scouts, and kind of have a good scoring package as well as a lot of vehicles that are really good. So the stuff like that is kind of what I'm talking about when I say going wide, or lists that are designed to score some more points consistently even in a losing matchup. But yeah, so the idea is that you'll get bigger wins than you will losses, and then there was the flex spot of your 5th list if you're going for like the 1 flex spot or 2 flex spots, however you want to really work it. Again, all these things really depend on the meta calls. I think a vehicle skew is really interesting when you take 3 vehicles into more balanced lists, because you can really pin things with the vehicles and then try and get the other vehicle list. Maybe have 2 that's really extreme, like maybe like your Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights are really extreme builds, and then you have one that's a bit more laid back. Maybe it's like a Demonic Incursion list that can kind of play the game pretty consistently as well, because it has a bunch, has a 6-inch deep strike, so you can just kind of score no matter what happens. So kind of something like that, and then have 2 more balanced lists, whether it's like a Gladius or an Orcs Warhorde, or something a bit more that can just go a bit more wide as well. And then table picks can be very important here. So this is why I was saying putting up a defender to get rid of a bad table instead of actually picking a good table. So often there's like 1 to 2, maybe 3 tables, especially in 8s, 4 tables, that can be really, really bad for specific vehicle armies. Like super elves aren't really great for them. They can be okay in some regards. Obviously those are pretty much all gone now, but there's still a lot of layouts that are just kind of not great for vehicles. This is obviously WTC. In GW, it doesn't really matter as much. Most of the tables are pretty good for vehicle skews. Actually, I would say if you're playing on GW terrain in a teams event, vehicle skews are a lot more interesting, and something you should really try and like figure out how you can abuse that kind of the fact that vehicles are very strong on GW layouts. And then you have the UKTC, which is kind of a bit of both. There's a really good staging, but I don't think vehicles are as good, but they're still pretty interesting. I think melee also works really, really well on UKTC. But making sure that you're picking the correct tables for the correct armies when you have that selection, pulling away bad matchups as soon as you can, pulling away bad tables as soon as you can, because that's also a really important way to make the rest of the pairing process easier for your team and your captain, is to make sure that you're pulling away the bad tables, so then there isn't as many options, and if your opponent also needs to pull one of the tables that might necessarily not be good for you onto one of the other factions, there's a lot of stuff you can do there to kind of play around that game. And that's the vehicle skew. Next we have the balanced skew, which is where you take, it's not really a skew, it's just how a lot of team comps happen, whereas you take a couple of lists that are kind of all-rounders, maybe even just 5 all-rounder lists, 5 lists that are like just the meta list at the moment. Maybe you take a Meta Eldari, Chaos Space Marines, Astra Militarum, Tyranids, and whatever else. Let's say like a World Eaters list. So you have a bit of everything there, but no you're not targeting anything specific. You're just trying to take good stuff, which is a really valid way to play teams. But what I will say is it makes the pairings a lot harder, because if you're not teching towards any specific matchups, it can make things really, really difficult for the pairing side, because if you're giving them one good option and one average option, or one average option and one bad option, they're going to take the average option, and your pairings are you're never going to be able to pin anything, and you're never really going to be able to get really great pairings yourself. So it's very safe, but it's also very risky in a different way, whereas you might actually end up getting either a lot of draws or a lot of slight losses, just because you're not actually building a comp for teams. You're building singles lists and then playing them as a team, which is, it translates partially, but it doesn't translate fully. So just something you can kind of consider. I do actually rate the balanced kind of play style, but a lot more thought has to go into it instead of just, oh, let's take the 5 meta lists at the moment. Like, we all play these factions, cool, let's just play the 5 strongest lists. Whereas it might actually be better, like, Gilliman's pretty best in Gladius, but maybe there's a Stormlight, a really aggressive style list that might be better for them to take. It's just kind of seeing these things and figuring out exactly what you need to do to make your team comp work as a combined unit, not just 5 individuals. So what do we need to look for is a mixture of army types. That's kind of what you get. You want some stuff that's mostly resilient to other comps. This is also something that can be risky. If being a bit more hedged into every army means that you also aren't capitalizing on your army strengths as much. You're just focusing on the weaknesses in your army, which again isn't a bad thing. But for teams, you kind of want to focus on the positives of your army, not trying to break the weaknesses of your army. And yeah, as I said, lower score potential than others, because it's really difficult to pair into a really solid matchup. For our Warp Wars, the video that will be linked somewhere around, from our Warp Wars that we won a couple of weeks ago, with my team that I played with, the Chili Cow Cartel, I captained the team. What we kind of figured is there was probably going to be a lot of melee, because 1, New Zealand likes melee armies, and 2, melee is quite strong at the moment. So we made sure that we had elite infantry killer armies. We had stuff that's good into vehicles, but also just good into melee. So we had like tactical orcs before the nerf. We have custodies, which can be good into vehicles because it had a volume of good damage AP2, but also good into melee matchups because there was talons, and you had the reactive move, and you have all this other stuff. And we had a Gladius that was really, really built towards beating damage 3 and below and toughness 9 and below lists. Then we also had like Admech and Bridgehead, which can be really good blunters for vehicle armies, or really good at killing vehicle armies. So we kind of had this good like branch where we tried to make sure we covered all of our bases, but we made sure we lent into every army's strength when we did that. I would say we did have a balanced skew, but we made sure we picked things to be skewed in specific ways. We skewed a little bit to be anti-pressure armies or anti-melee armies, and anti-elite infantry armies. But we also didn't try and weaken ourselves, so with our other matchups, we made sure that we had armies that were resilient enough to play into the bad matchups and still get, 7, 8, 9 differential points. So we were really trying to make sure we didn't get below a 5 in any matchup with help with pairings. Obviously, there was some matchups that were really bad for us. John T, our Space Marine player, absolute legend, but we had to make sure we babied or princessed him a little bit, because if he got into a bad matchup, he was supposed to be one of our big scorers every round. So we had to make sure that he got into a decent matchup to make sure we got those big wins. So it's kind of these things that you have to kind of figure out in a balanced list. Next, we have the melee pressure. This is kind of like the next kind of big skew that you'll talk about. So melee and it's slash pressures. So there is shooting pressure lists as well. So this is like the motto of fast gun good. It can be a pressure list as well, because you can put so much pressure on your opponent with, say, like a Mont Cartel list, where it's like, well, if you come out, I'm just going to delete you. So like you can't come out. So it either draws games out, or if your opponent does have to come out because they think they need to win, then you can just go out and table them. Lots of stuff like that can all come into being with this kind of style of melee slash pressure skew. So you're talking about your Creations of Bio, your Custodies infantry style lists, your World Eaters, your Vanguard Nids, your Mont Cartel, even your Votann can be quite pressure intensive. All these kind of lists. Imperial Knights can also be one that if you take out a bunch of big knights, they can also be a list that you can just kind of throw at your opponent pretty intently and pretty intensely, and try and get those bigger differentials. So that's kind of like the whole idea of the melee pressure. Pairings can be very easy with this army, which is a really, really nice thing to be able to do, is especially if you're new to pairings, having a more aggressive style team comp can really help make pairings. But there will be one or two matchups that you'll get which are going to be absolute dumpster fire. You're probably going to have to pair something into something that's really bad for it and just hope for the best. If you're going for a really aggressive 4 to 5 person melee / pressure army, pressure comp. So yes, it can be easy because like, cool, I could just put pretty much any two armies up. The only kind of differentiator there is if it's shooting or if it's melee. Usually you want like an even mix of both. You can go in an extreme of one or the other if you really wanted to. You can also just have, like, say, 3 strong melee armies, or 2 strong melee, a strong shooting, like aggressive shooting army, and then 2 more balanced. You can really, like, these skews are, I'm explaining this here so I give you the pieces to try and build your own puzzle, right? Like you gotta cut the shapes out yourself and then fit them together. I'm just here to explain what the shapes can be, so then you can cut them out and put them together yourself, if that kind of makes sense. The other things that can happen with like a melee pressure skew is you have fast games, especially 1 or 2 games. Ending really quickly can be really good to understanding how the other games need to play out. If you know a game can be done in under an hour, hour and a half, especially if you know it's a really good matchup, get them to play quite fast, and then have one of your other games that's obviously on a clock. You're not going to use this to abuse clocks, and I'll never promote trying to abuse time. You should have 50% of the time in a game, and that's all you should ever get. But if you can have games that finish early, then you can understand how many points you need to get with your other games, whether you can play really safe or if you need to go a bit more aggressive to try and get some more points. The great thing about the pressure lists here is you have the accessibility of kind of turning on the gas a bit later, because you're kind of a bit more all in from the get-go. And yeah, it's a high risk, high reward. I really rate the pressure, the melee / pressure skews for the fact that if you need to win an event, you need to take some risks. And this is kind of the riskiest of the bunch. If you make a wrong call, if you realize they're like, okay, now there's too much to counter me, you will fall apart and you will not do well. And like, that is just it. You'll have some teams you might come up against, be like, oh, well, they have 4 answers to our 5 armies. That's a real big issue. But a lot of the time, if you can figure it out and you kind of stretch that line of where you need to be, and I kind of balance on it, you can do absolutely diabolical things with like a melee pressure or any of these skews, to be fair. If you can target your meta and figure out exactly what you need to do, that's kind of the idea there. So how do we decide what to choose? Okay, so this is kind of what I'm just talking about. The first thing I would always do is, once you've kind of figured out, I want to go for a more vehicle skew, or I want to go for a more infantry skew, whatever it might be, is make a test matrix. I showed this in my video about us winning warp wars, and it's basically a matrix where instead of having just the 5 or 8 factions you can play against, make sure both my hands are on screen here, is you list every single faction and even multiple factions as the different detachments work differently, and you get everyone on your team to go through and just table agnostic, mission agnostic, how do they feel into all those factions. And then at the end of that, you sort it all by the best to worst. So you know what is your worst matchup wholeheartedly throughout the whole comp, and what's your best matchup. And you can see if there's any like huge holes. If you have more than like 5 or 6 armies that are absolute reds for your entire team comp, or 4 of your 5, that's a real issue, and you need to probably actually swap out someone in your comp to fix that issue, because you need more than one answer to a problem. So it's kind of stuff like that. So if you're finding that's an issue, make that matrix and then figure out, okay, who's the best person to flex here. I really like having Marines that can be really flexible. I really like a flexible Orc list can be really strong. And also Tyrants can be one that can go from an aggressive melee to a heavy vehicle So especially if they have access to some GSC, to the final day, there's a lot of different things you can balance into there with those kind of two factions there as well. So kind of having those as kind of like your flex spots. So, okay, how do we tweak this to make these matchups better for you? So then we can put you into them and get a good score. And you'll also see what you're really good into and be like, okay, well, do we really need the third a good army into Agents of the Imperium? No, probably not. Okay, are they going to be that common? No. Okay, so we can tone down that list and change that one because we don't need that many good matchups into X faction. Maybe Thousand Suns is something that you've put as a really strong, like a really weak faction, a strong faction for your comp, weak into your comp. Then you can kind of just do this things like, well, okay, well, what's the faction that has the other worst matchups? Cool, this one, sweet. Pull that one out. And then either change this or even change the faction if you have access to that. Obviously, all of this is to do with accessibility to factions. I'm assuming that you have access to all factions, and then you can cut this down to whatever factions you have access to. And then you can kind of slot back in whatever faction you think fills the role that you're missing in your team comp a bit more. So that's how you kind of like go about it a little bit. And then this is how you defeat specific metas. So if you can be really on the dial, really on the line, and know kind of what people are bringing, you can really like destroy pairings and then destroy all of your games. Like at Warp Wars, we did such a good job. We decided what the meta was going to be, built our lists for that meta, and we did really well because it made pairing super easy. We never had really any issues with pairings, and then our games were also super accurate because we were very confident with our armies and how to play into the specific matchups that we got. So you want to determine what the top 5 to 10 factions are. This isn't always perfect, but what this does is there's always going to be probably about 4 to 5 teams out of say like 15 to 20 teams that are just going to play the top factions. They're just going to play what is good. And this is kind of one of the things that doesn't irk me because it is kind of like one of the styles of playing teams is you just take the best lists and hope for the best. And because you know there's going to be quite a few of those, and even the teams that only take 1 or 2 of them, you still want to understand what they're bringing and how to tech against them. So like maybe Eldar's really prominent and okay, well, I'm just going to make sure that we have a list or 2 that can beat Eldar. Specifically 2 is really good. Obviously, you don't want to build them just to beat Eldar. They need to be good into more than just one faction. They need to be good into many factions. But maybe swapping out 1 unit in your army list to make them slightly better into Eldar can be a really good thing to kind of do here. This is where the fine tuning can kind of come in a little bit. But first, you do need to determine what the top 5 to 10 factions are. And then pick 3 to 5, 3 for 5s, 5 for 8s factions that are good into those factions, right? So into all of these. Obviously, you can't pick 3 factions that are going to be good into 10 factions or 5 factions. But you want to make sure that you have factions that are good into the meta. Because if you can't beat the meta, you're going to lose to the armies that are just taking the 5 strongest lists, right? So you need to make sure that you're built for that enough, but then also not detrimenting whatever, if you're building a skew or whatever your idea is for your composition, you're not breaking that down because of the top of the meta, the top of the popular list at the moment. So it's kind of, again, a balancing act there of how much you do there, but I definitely think you need 1 or 2 lists that are just going to be really solid into the top 3, 4, 5 lists in the meta right now. And then again, that you could be looking at different tier lists. I do tier lists, Art of War does tier lists, StatCheck does tier lists. A bunch of great creators do this kind of stuff. So you can use their stuff, and if you listen to other content or watch other content, absorb as much as you can from everyone, and then make a decision with all the information that you can get access to. There's also StatCheck's dashboard with all the win-losses and what's good into what. So you can use that if your team's not super confident on what's good into what. Use that as some like additional data to kind of add some confidence for your players and add some knowledge for the pairings and matrix. And then the other couple of factions that you have that aren't paired towards the meta or whatever you're trying to target, they're your safety net. the other lists, like your AdMech, a lot of the time Orcs I found is actually really good in this. Your Tyranids, your GSC, all this kind of stuff are really good at kind of blanking stuff, but also having some good matchups. You don't want a defender list. I don't really love the idea of sword and shield lists or attacker and defender lists, because everything should be good at attacking some stuff and should be good at defending against some stuff. Yes, the value of how much you're good at attacking and defending will change. You might be only good at attacking a couple, but you're really, really good at defending a lot. That's totally fine, but you need to make sure that you are still giving yourself positive matchups and you're not weakening your army list with a specific faction just to not lose, because you still want to have upside. And you don't want it just to be player skilled upside. You want to be able to be like, okay, like my list is really good is really good at not losing, but it's also pretty good into vehicle lists. So you kind of want to like, okay, like I can be really good at not losing by a lot, but then I'm going to take an extra couple of anti-tank guns to kind of punch up in those matchups a little bit. Stuff like that is kind of what you want to think about here. And again, I'm not trying to say that you completely swap out lists and everything. It's these little minutiae of lists in the team comp that can really help with this pairings. Because if you make what would normally be like maybe a 10-10 and differential and make it a 12-8 in your favor, that's actually a huge difference on the pairing side. If you're pretty confident that just by swapping out 200 points, you're not really dropping your floor too much, but you're opening up your ceiling in a couple of matchups, especially matchups that might be weak for the rest of your team, is so huge. So it's that's the kind of stuff that I think you should think about when you're thinking about your comps. So also I ranked here what I think are the most strongest comps at the moment. I think pressure and melee definitely is one of the strongest ways to play 40k at the moment, but I also think you can build around it in a team really, really aggressively. You can take lists that are super good into the pressure style lists, so I don't think they actually win out in a team's environment. I think they'll be very popular, and I think those kind of style lists will be like taken as much as like an A tier one, but I think pressure and balanced kind of fall into the B tier. Pressure because that they can be countered really heavily, and balanced because they just don't have that much upside. They have not much downside either, which is why they're in B, but they just don't have a huge amount of upside and really capitalizing on good pairings. You have to capitalize on just a strong list with a strong player. So if your other team has built a composition to beat the meta, then you're going to be in an uphill battle. So I do think, I do think vehicle lists are probably the best at the moment. There isn't a whole lot of anti-tank at the moment. There is some, don't get me wrong. But if people are taking to build against pressure, they're building a lot of strength 8, 9, and 10 weapons into their lists, and like damage 2 to 3, not necessarily D6, specifically not D6. It's really D6 plus 2 maybe, but again, there's really low volumes. So you really want to go to the flat 3, 4 damage weapons, which are sure fine, but if you're only strength 9, 10, even 11, a lot of the vehicle skews, toughness 10, toughness 11, toughness 12, you're surviving a lot of that, especially if you can get cover, especially if you have 2-up saves. All this kind of stuff can really compound and really push into a really, really strong composition at the moment. I think like 3 vehicle lists and 2 other flex lists is a really interesting place to be with a 5-man comp, and I think 4 vehicle and then 4 balanced in the 8s is also a really, really interesting place to be. Whereas I think that would be like a Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, probably like a Crusher Stampede and a Demonic Incursion, or maybe even Shadow Legion. Probably more Demonic Legion though, because you want the more big guys, and I think Demonic Incursion does that better. You kind of like maybe those 4, and again, there's multiples of others that you could take. You could take a Votan vehicle heavy list. There's all this kind of stuff you could think about. But like 4 of those kind of style lists, and then 4 more kind of just like, maybe 1 more is tech towards like a pressure style list, or a, whatever you kind of determine in the meta at that time. But this is how I kind of see it at the moment. Infantry, I think the only issue with infantry heavy lists is the pressure lists can kind of beat you down a lot of the time. But again, if you think there's going to be a lot of vehicle lists, the infantry list kind of gets stonks up really quickly and become a lot more popular. So it's all a balancing act, and it's all determining what you think is going to be there to what you can take to counter it, right? And it's going to be a bit of gut feeling and a bit of meta research. You're going to take both of those into account and then make your decision, because you're never going to get it perfect, but the goal is to try and take a little bit of a risk to get some kind of reward. So in closing, there's a few things that I just wanted to bring up. The first one is have a plan for your team. You want to make sure that everyone on your team is on board with your plan as well, because you need to make sure that, okay, as a team, we've decided that vehicles are going to be really, really heavy in the meta at the moment. Okay, sweet. So we want to take more infantry lists or lists that are teched to beating vehicles. Okay, cool. So we've got Jeff, Kevin, and Leroy. The three of them are going to take lists that beat vehicles, and the other two of us are going to take armies that are just good into the field. Okay, cool. That's our plan. Everyone's on board with that. Cool. Let's go and practice your lists to find any issues we have with it and any weaknesses we have. Let's also build like a test matrix. After we've played a few games, we can kind of get a gauge of how we're feeling with our armies. Is there things we need to tweak? Is there matchups that are really horrible for us? And are those matchups really popular in the meta right now? Do we need to change something around? Do we need to play around anything? So that's kind of like where all this kind of comes to like a conclusion. And then the last thing I really wanted to say, guys, is just have fun with this. This is like one of my favorite parts. Like building lists and building team compositions is my favorite thing to do on 40k. It is so much fun. It is a lot of work when you're having to work with people, work with a bunch of different lists, understanding so many different factions, because you need to know your factions really well, and you also need to be able to quiz people on other factions really, really well to get really good data here. But it is so much fun, and it's like the best part of the team's experience. You get to play 40k if you're playing singles or teams, but you only get to do this kind of stuff when you're playing in teams. So I hope you enjoyed this, guys. This has been super, super fun for me to do. I love talking about teams. Please let me know in the description below what your kind of favorite team comps are at the moment, things that you like to, that you'd be interested to try, any tips that you got from this video that you want to try out later as well. Like the video as you always would, subscribe, because I love seeing that subscriber number going up at the moment. It's really giving me a lot of energy. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next time.